Hello, students, and welcome to Chapter 5, Basic News Writing. The skills we're going to go over in this chapter are imperative, right? They are the basic guidelines for writing any kind of news story. So let's go ahead and get started. Um, so you want to master the basics of news writing. That's what we're going to try to do in this chapter and this week, right? You follow a simple style, and the conventions of the trade are going to make your readers and editors and peers trust you. Practice reading and confidence are key here. Well, what gives you confidence? Practice and knowing the style by heart so that when you're working on a story, you can focus on the reporting. While reporting, you're already putting the story into the inverted pyramid inverted pyramid form. For example, when you're taking notes at a press conference and you're writing down quotes or you're listening to the quotes, you might already in your head be deciding which quote you're going to use. You're going to be deciding which piece of information goes in the lead, which information goes further down. You start to think like a reporter with every story you see. You get that from practice. One of the best ways to get practice, of course, is to read articles. But the other thing you can do as a CCP student is you can contact the student Vanguard and see if they're looking for writers. In my experience, I used to be in charge of that program. They're almost always looking for writers. So practice is really key here. And once you practice and once you get that down, that means when you're on a strict deadline, once the reporting is done, the writing is quick, easy, and second nature, right? The majority of your time as a reporter isn't spent writing. Because of that inverted pyramid form, the majority of your time is spent reporting, collecting the information. The inverted pyramid. This is the standard format for how most print and online hard news stories are written. The difference between hard and soft news, obviously, is hard news is crime, it's court systems, it's politics, climate change, etc. Whereas soft news is usually more celebrities, cats stuck in a tree, not as serious, not necessary for people in a democratic society to make everyday decisions. The inverted pyramid starts with the most important information, then presents information in a descending order that goes from most important to least important. It starts with a lead that tells the reader who, what, where, and when. Then you usually have a quote or a nut graph that adds context, perhaps why or how. Note that some editors prefer a quote between the lead and the nut graph. This demonstrates that you have conducted interviews and done research. Quotes exist as their own paragraphs. Often you're going to write one or two paragraphs, then a quote, one or two paragraphs, then a quote. This format allows a reader to get what they need to know quickly and move on to the next story, while still allowing a reader who has more interest to get more detail. It also allows editors to cut the story for space on the page for breaking news or for an ad or for anything else that they may want to put in that spot. The lead. Lead writing is incredibly difficult because you're trying to get as much information as possible to the reader in one sentence in about 30 words, right? It's the most important sentence of your story. It introduces the reader to the most important elements of your story. It answers the who, what, where, and when. The straight news lead is the most common. It's just the facts of the story. One sentence around 30 words. Whenever possible, straight leads and almost all leads should be attributed. It can even be sources say, and then you include the specific source later on, right? But almost all information, which we're going to go over in a little bit about attribution, all information that comes from a source that doesn't come from your own observation needs to be attributed. Summary leads is kind of like an outline of the whole story, should still be one sentence, around 30 words, and again, attributed whenever possible. The blind lead just doesn't name the people in the lead. It could say, a person fell, etc., etc. Direct address leads use second person. You might think that it's going to be hot today or something like that. The question lead asks questions of the audience, and then a direct quote lead is obvious. That starts with a direct quote. For us, for this semester, I think we should start with the straight news lead, and I would do that so that you can start developing a portfolio that shows that you know how to use that lead, because that is the most common and the most acceptable. Developing the story. Since you're the one who gathered the information, it's up to you to decide the order based on the importance of the story. You're the expert, right? So try to see your story as the audience would see it, and ask, as Stovall asks us, if I were reading this story, what would I want to know next? Another method is to get kind of more and more specific as your story goes on. You start general, and then you move into the more specific elements as you get down. You always start your lead and your story with the number of deceased, then the number of injured, then the number of people affected. And you can see that even here, your lead goes in inverted pyramid because obviously the most important is the number of deceased, then the number of injured, then the number of affected. Transitions. While the inverted pyramid uses a logical organizational strategy, you still need transitions to help keep your story together. These are the different types of transitions we use for news stories according to Stovall. Connectors, which are basically conjunctions, right? Which we use to connect two independent clauses to complete sentences. We have hooks, which are repeated words and phrases. If you have a story about photosynthesis, you're going to repeat photosynthesis throughout the story. You've been told in previous writing classes, try not to repeat yourself. In journalism, especially hard news, it's okay, right, to repeat words because these are kind of hooks that keep the story together. You want to use pronouns, right? Somebody's name, then pronoun, then name. But you always want to make sure that it's clear in your story what the pronoun represents. Associations, these are repeated ideas, maybe with different words. So sometimes you're going to repeat words, sometimes you're going to use different words, right? Chronology is another transition. Time reference. This is really, really important. Um, so that the reader knows exactly what's happening, exactly the time sequence of the story, right? So for example, the big story in the news right now is the shooting in Texas. What reporters are trying to do is they're trying to get that timeline, right? So that they can use chronology to try to tell the reader exactly what happened and when. What's interesting with this story is that there are different, is that the reporters are having a real hard time, kind of nailing down the exact chronology of events. Enumeration, you can number items, right? According to City Council, there are 3 priorities this year: 1 paragraph, 2 paragraph, 3 paragraph, in that order. Using quotations. Quotes make your story come alive on the page, right? Quotes also demonstrate that you've done your homework, you've gone out and you've gotten information from firsthand sources who know the story better than anybody else, right? Couple rules. You always want to use quotation marks for direct quotes. Then the attribution for print stories and website stories goes after, right? Quote, the new tax will punish hardworking Americans, comma, end quote, Senator Scott said. We always use past tense for attribution in written stories, and it always goes subject, verb. The person who spoke said. You also don't want to use, fancy words like eloquently states, right? The word said is preferable. You're going to repeat it, so just get used to it and use it. Always use the exact words of your source. This is why we use recording devices. And also, don't take the quotes out of context. For example, a quote that Hillary Clinton said during the 2016 election that was taken out of context was the one about deplorables, right? I think the exact quote is Hillary Clinton said, half of Trump voters are a basket of deplorables. That was the quote that made the papers. The second half of the quote said that the other half of Trump supporters are good, hardworking Americans, et cetera, et cetera. So that quote was actually taken out of context. Um, so you never want to use a quote that's inaccurate or that can be interpreted inaccurately by the audience. You also don't want to have quotes one after the other, yet intersperse them throughout the article. You also want to use them sparingly. You don't want to have a whole story of quotes, right? They provide color and information. They usually don't provide new information. They usually help put things into context, right? Quotes go in their own paragraph, even if it's one sentence. And then if a quote comes from a press release, you should state that it came from a press release. Because as reporters, the audience assumes that we went out and that we actually talked to people. That's what we do, right? But sometimes we don't have time. Sometimes a quote from a press release is enough. So therefore, we should state that we got that quote from a press release. Also, because we're doing a lot of interviews via email, if it's not a live interview, some reporters, some editors want you to say, Smith said in an email. This just shows that it wasn't a live interview. Headlines. Headlines are now more important than ever due to search engine optimization and increased competition for readers. However, we want to avoid misleading headlines and any form of clickbait. Nothing destroys a news organization's reputation quicker than clickbait, right? We've all seen this time and time again on social media, on certain websites. You click on a story, it's not really the story, right? You want to be clear, accurate, and precise, all while attracting the reader's attention, which is really, really difficult. Just like leads, headlines use as few words as possible, so they can be really difficult to write. You want to be specific, but don't repeat words in the lead. You don't use specific facts in the headline. You want to avoid ambiguity and double meanings, right? You don't want to make it mysterious. You just want to kind of state what the story is about. Usually copy editors write headlines, but you should know how to write your own because when newsrooms cut budgets, which they're always doing, it's usually the copy editors that are the first to go, right? Where we use past tense in most print stories, we actually use present tense for headlines, right? This makes it kind of more immediate, more in your face. Um, You want to avoid the use of articles like the word the. Instead of writing the strike continues, you just write strike continues. We want to use commas instead of conjunctions. You don't want to start with a verb. You always start with a subject, and you want to avoid pronouns because if those are the first words that your readers see, they're not going to know who the pronoun represents, right? So those are the basics. Of course, there's great detail and great examples in the textbook, but the textbook also talks about news writing in the present and the future. I think the textbook says writing in the future. I think every day is the future, right? Our present is the future. So the media is changing every day. You need to be flexible and ready to adapt to those changes. You need to learn how to use social media while still adhering to traditional ethics and guidelines, right? So a lot of reporters will say, check out my story about such and such on Twitter. They won't give you a lot of information, but they'll say, give you kind of like a teaser about what it's about. So, and they might even put specific facts or specific quotes to try to get the reader into the publication, right? So we need to know how to use Twitter especially. The textbook also mentions WordPress. WordPress is an open source platform, web platform that allows you to design your own web pages. A lot of professional news organizations, I think even the city of Philadelphia uses it. It's a really easy platform to use, so I would also suggest knowing. Obviously, most of you know how to use Twitter and Instagram, but also get to know WordPress and get to know any other platforms that are kind of emerging that you might be asked to use for a publication, right? In order to get a job, you have to stay updated on changes in mass media. One really exciting thing I think is happening today is that old school journalists like me are going to start retiring, or they're just going to get laid off or whatever. And then there's going to be new generation of reporters who are much more comfortable using technology, using the platforms that exist to get stories out there, or even to use those platforms for their reporting, right? In order to stay updated on these changes, I use websites like pointer.org, the Society of Professional Journalists, so you can look at those websites. All right, so those are the basics. Master the basics, and then we will go on from there. Keep up the good work and stay smart and healthy out there.